Hello, and welcome to the Walrus Talks Sovereign Canada, presented by Rogers. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I am the Executive Director of the Walrus, and I'm also your host this evening. We are thrilled to be back here in person at the Isabel Bader Theatre in Toronto, streaming live online at thewalrus.ca. A big hello and welcome to the over 600 households who have registered for our live stream. We have audience members tuning in from all over. In Canada, that includes Abbotsford, Brampton, Calgary, Dartmouth, Hamilton. I think the people laughing are like, I know people there, that's why you're laughing. Grand Prairie, Windsor, and Yellowknife. And welcome to those who are tuning in from around the world. Hello, Barcelona, San Francisco, Mumbai, and Washington, D.C. Yes, welcome to them all. We encourage you all to share this conversation, whether it's highlights, quotes, even if you take photos on social media. You can tag us at The Walrus across platforms, and you can use our hashtag Walrus Talks. A hashtag is a great opportunity to connect our in-person audience with our audience tuning in from across Canada and around the world. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered within the bounds of Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land is also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And at the Walrus, we're honored to carry on a tradition of storytelling. We encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on, whether you're joining us today in person in downtown Toronto or online somewhere else. A bit about the Walrus. The Walrus is Canada's conversation. We cover stories across Canada to offer a deeper understanding of who we are for those inside and outside the country. This year, from tariffs to taunts of becoming the 51st state to tariffs again, Canada is the conversation, and the country is standing strong. We are responding to this moment with facts, analysis, and even some humor at the Walrus. You can find our work online at thewalrus.ca, in print on newsstands, or by subscribing to The Walrus. You can also listen to our stories on audio, podcast, or online, and take part in events like this one here. This work is proudly independent, and it's powered by our community of donors, supporters, and partners. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and to Rogers for partnering with us in this event, as well as working with us as a national sponsor throughout the year. To tell us more, a round of applause and welcome for Colette Watson, President, Rogers Sports and Media.
Thank you. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. It is a real pleasure to be with you and our partners at the Walrus. The theme tonight is Sovereign Canada. And I think we can all agree how relevant and critical this topic is right now. Typically, Canada is a country that holds a quiet pride in our history, our storytelling, and the reputation we've built around the world. Rarely have we had to actively consider how we tell our own story and how to best advance our country's interests. But I think we can all agree now is the time to have the conversation more openly. For 65 years, Rogers has been a proud Canadian company connecting Canadians. This has been a part of our identity since we were founded in 1960 by the late Ted Rogers. It started with one radio station, CHFI, right here in Toronto. From FM radio to cable TV, high-speed internet to wireless, Rogers always reinvested in Canada. Ted had many chances to sell the company or move it to the US, but he always said no. Instead, we built networks here in Canada, networks that underpin the Canadian economy. We invested to be part of the Canadian broadcasting system. We became sports owners to keep the Toronto Blue Jays in Canada. Speaking of which, go Jays. And today we connect Canadians and businesses to the best networks from coast to coast to coast. We are witnessing firsthand how sports can unite a country because we've invested in the best sports and entertainment. We saw it earlier this year in the Four Nations hockey tournament, and now Canadian fans from coast to coast are rallying around the Toronto Blue Jays. Last night, 15 million Canadians were reached by our broadcast. We bring Canadians original programming that tell our stories through a uniquely Canadian lens. We deliver local and multilingual news to communities across Canada. And like many Canadian companies, including the Canadian media industry, we face real regulatory barriers. In our case, barriers that can impact our cultural sovereignty. I have a close-up view to this as a leader in the broadcasting system. We are happy to and want to compete with more players in the market, but we need to compete fairly. This requires a level playing field with US streaming giants. Right now, Canadian broadcasters, the ones bringing you local news, Canadian content, are doing so with regulations that are outdated and harmful to the future growth of our business. This evening, you'll hear from 7 speakers covering Canadian sovereignty from every angle, including economic, Indigenous, broadcasting communications, innovation, and more, all exploring how we can make our country stronger in the face of threats. It's a critical time for Canada, and we need to get this right for our country, our economy, and for our national identity. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you to the Walrus for convening this evening.
Thank you, Colette. And I think a few of us were up late last night watching the game. So let me say it and get it out of our systems. Go, Jays, go. What does sovereignty mean for Canada in a rapidly changing world? Tonight, we have 7 speakers with 7 minutes each to share insights into the policies, priorities, and possibilities shaping Canadian independence. This evening, we'll be hearing from Stephen Maher, journalist and novelist; Marisa Beck, research director, Clean Growth, Canadian Climate Institute; Jesse McCormick, consultant, Indigenous participation in major project developments; Richard Stursberg, former media executive, assistant deputy minister for culture and broadcasting, and was head of English services at CBC; Deanna Horton, distinguished fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto and the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada; the Honorable James Moore, former Minister of Industry; and Sean Speer, co-founder and editor-at-large at The Hub. A round of applause, and thank you all for joining us.
Good evening. I'm Stephen Maher, and it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here in this beautiful theater talking to a room full of people who feel passionately enough about their country that you're here instead of staking out a table someplace where you can watch the ball game. So thank you all. I'm delighted also to be in Toronto, enjoying your warm Upper Canadian hospitality. I'm typically resident in Mi'kma'ki, the homeland of the Mi'kmaq people, specifically the South Shore of Nova Scotia. And I was reflecting recently that I catch mackerel and drink rum simultaneously at times in the same waters where my people, my ancestors, have been drinking rum and catching mackerel since the 1750s, or earlier maybe. I've been thinking about that, about them, about my ancestors, about your ancestors, about Canadians' ancestors, ever since Donald Trump started calling Justin Trudeau governor and threatening to annex Canada. The idea of living under the Stars and Stripe is abhorrent to me, as it was, I think, to my ancestors who came in ships as refugees from New York City to Shelburne in 1783. So I think that it rattled me when he started threatening us. It rattled my idea of what might happen. I worked for 15 years as a journalist in the press gallery in Ottawa, and one of the things that I learned doing that work is that the best way to think about what might happen next is to consider what happened in the past in similar circumstances. So after Mr. Trump started making his threats, I did some historical research on the history of Canadian nationalism and the history of Canada. People sometimes complain that Canadian nationalism consists of nothing more than a kind of reflexive anti-Americanism, which I don't think is accurate. It's more a deeply rooted, carefully, well-grounded anti-Americanism or anti-American imperialism. If you look at the history, the whole point of Canada is creating a space for the three founding peoples, Indigenous, French Canadian, and Loyalist, can chart a future based on different values, less violent, more respectful of minority rights. That was self-consciously stated by the players at the beginning. The story really begins, I think, at the end of the 7 Years' War, which the Americans called the French and Indian War, and which in Quebec they call la guerre de la conquête, the War of the Conquest, because it ended with the conquest of Montreal, of Quebec City, and then of Montreal in the fall of New France. This was a catastrophe for French Canadians, for the people of New France, although I think my ancestors were likely delighted at the news. And it led to a period where the British were triumphant, but desirous of peace and stability. They wanted to stop spending money on musket battles in distant colonies. So King George III did two things to try to make a permanent peace. One was the Quebec Act, which guaranteed Quebecers the right to their language and religion. And the other was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which recognized Indigenous title to Indigenous land and forbade the inhabitants of the 13 colonies from crossing the Appalachian Mountains to engage in wars of conquest against the Indigenous nations on the other side, in the Ohio River Valley, for instance, where George Washington owned 7,000 acres of land. The Americans tell themselves and us a story about the Revolution that is about tea, tariffs, and taxation without representation. I have come to believe, from my study of history, that the desire to carry out wars of conquest against the Indigenous nations was more important than any of those things, and the stated reasons in their historical propaganda. I was confirmed in that belief last week when I listened to an interview with the American documentarian Ken Burns, in which he said he believed that was the primary motivating factor for the American Revolution. At the time of the Revolution, the Americans sent their most diplomatic character, Ben Franklin, to Montreal to try to sweet-talk the French Canadians into joining their project. The French Canadians did not trust the Americans. The Indigenous Canadians had very good reason to distrust the Americans, and the Loyalists were in the process of being driven out and, in some cases, tarred and feathered. So you have an alliance at the beginning of Canada of three peoples who wanted to live in a different way, with peace, order, and good government, accommodation, respect for minority rights. And they fought together successfully to repel American aggression during the American Revolution and during the War of 1812. When the Americans concluded the War of 1812, they finally began their westward expansion, which is a tale of great suffering for many people. The Trail of Tears, the Battle of Wounded Knee, whereas on the north side of the Medicine Line, we were following a policy of accommodation and treaty making. This is not the night to talk about the many failures in our observing the treaties, but I think it's telling that the most important opponents to Alberta separatism now are Blackfoot and Cree in Alberta, who, in spite of all of the failings of Confederation, know that they don't want to be under the Stars and Stripes. So throughout Canadian history, in all the elections to come, Canadians have repeatedly voted for Canadian sovereignty and against, to resist American aggression. I think the election of 1891, when Sir John A. beat Wilfrid Laurier, is the best example in a way. Macdonald was struggling with tariffs, and Laurier was proposing reciprocity, free trade with the Americans. At a raucous rally on King Street in Toronto, Macdonald produced proof in the form of stolen documents that showed Laurier's allies were conspiring with the Americans to allow for the annexation of Canada. Macdonald won a landslide. In every election since, including the election in 1988, the free trade election, a majority of Canadians voted for candidates opposed to, opposed to closer integration with the United States. The same thing was true in the election of 2025, when again Canadians voted for the candidate who seemed most likely to respect Canadian sovereignty. During that election, I spoke with I went to Montreal and to Alberta to talk to separatists in both those places to sort of find the weak points in the Federation. And I came to think about how they believed they were being true to their ancestors and their values by seeking to pursue their projects, which I can respect, but I hope they'll fail. And I think they will, because the people who are Canadian nationalists are so deeply rooted. I think of the Robertson Davies novel, What's Bred in the Bone, which comes from an English proverb, what's bred in the bone will come through in the flesh. And I think of the deep roots in the history of English Canadians, French Canadians, Indigenous people who desire sovereignty. And when I feel worried about the fact that we don't pay enough attention to our own history and so on, I'm given comfort by the fact that our feelings of connection to Canada are so deeply rooted. It's really in our bones. And because of that, I feel a sense of comfort and less fearful about American aggression. Thank you.
Good evening, my name is Marisa Beck. The Trump shock and its ripple effect in global markets are forcing Canada to think differently about the country's economic sovereignty. Given the break in Canada's most important trade relationship, the imperative for Canadian governments right now is to identify resilient engines of economic growth and prosperity and to build new diverse trade relationships. What does this focus on economic sovereignty mean for Canadian climate policy? Are there tensions between growing Canada's economy, making it less dependent on US trade, and decarbonizing it? Is it possible for Canada to do all these things at the same time? What my colleagues and I at the Canadian Climate Institute find is that there are actually sizable overlaps between these objectives. And it's in these overlaps that there are tremendous opportunity for Canadian leadership. So I'm going to be discussing 3 areas where both economic goals and climate goals naturally point in the same direction and are actually reinforcing each other. First area of overlap. Let's talk about clean energy and why Canada has what the world needs right now. Yes, the global clean energy transition is still happening, in fact, more than ever. The world is shifting to clean energy with or without the US. While America backtracks, acceleration is happening at the global scale. The International Energy Agency says that this year, 2/3 of all capital, global capital going into the energy sector is going to clean technologies, topping $2 trillion just this year, and the trajectory is upward. The thing is, government policy is not the main driver of this transition, of these investments. The credit goes to technological progress and simple economics. What I'm talking about is cost. The cost of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries are dropping. They're dropping fast, and they keep on getting cheaper the more we use these technologies. At the same time, we see demand for electricity going up with the electrification of industry, households, transports. Who here has an electric car at home or is heating their home with a heat pump? You wouldn't know it from the headlines necessarily, but global electric vehicle sales are soaring. In 2024, every 5th car sold worldwide was electric, and in China, it was every 2nd car. Canada is in a great position to take on a leadership role in this emerging clean energy economy. The country has what the world needs right now: critical minerals to build batteries, solar panels and EV charging stations, and also an already largely clean power grid, thanks to large hydro generation and nuclear power. If Canada plays its hand right, this clean energy transition will benefit our economic sovereignty. Canada's abundant clean electricity is a plus in the competition for industrial investment, but we need to build more made in Canada clean power fast to attract new investment that reduces emissions from industry, buildings, transport, while also supporting growth in new industries, such as artificial intelligence. because every talk right now has to mention AI at least once. These are two engines of Canada's clean growth right here, building out clean electricity systems and developing a critical mineral value chain. Those two pillars are key to an autonomous Canadian economy, and they are key to a decarbonized future. Second area where Canada's economic goals and climate goals naturally align, trade diversification. While the US is actively backing away from climate action, major potential trading partners for Canada, the EU, the UK, but also China and India, are leaning in. And to stay competitive in these markets, Canada must not abandon its climate policies. First and foremost, the industrial carbon price. Yes, the carbon price for industry has not been axed. It is alive, and it's Canada's most effective tool to cut emissions and to direct investment in clean technologies. It also makes Canadian companies more competitive when building these new trade relationships outside of the US. Let's take Europe as an example. Starting in January, the EU will have in place a carbon border tax. That means that it will impose a carbon tariff on imports that don't already have a price on carbon at home. Canada's industrial carbon price will therefore reduce the charges for Canadian products at the EU border. But it's not just Europe. China's national carbon market is set to expand significantly to include new sectors like steel, cement, and aluminum. India's new carbon market will come online next year, and these carbon markets in major economies will change global trade. And Canada, having had an industrial carbon price in place for a while now, is a step ahead here when it comes to building competitiveness in this changing world economy. Talking about trade and sovereignty, another approach to making the Canadian economy more autonomous and more resilient is upping interprovincial trade within Canada. Yet again, this goes hand in hand with reducing emissions when we're thinking about integrating Canada's electricity systems or integrating Canada's industrial carbon markets. That kind of integration, a more integrated Canada, will mean more efficient electricity systems, a more efficient carbon market. It's a win-win situation. Third area of overlap. When we're thinking about synergies between economic sovereignty and reducing emissions, we have to talk about clean tech innovation. Innovation and entrepreneurship are key drivers for long-term resilient economic prosperity. But where is innovation happening these days? It's happening in clean tech. Think of batteries and their recycling. Think of technologies that help industries electrify, industries like steel and mining. These innovations surely reduce emissions, but they also make the economy more productive overall. An electric car or a heat pump overall uses a lot less energy than their conventional counterparts. Canada must get better at transforming these clean tech innovations into global market leadership for climate benefits and economic benefits. So to sum it up, the clean energy transition is changing the global economy quickly and irreversibly. Most economies around the world, except for the United States, understand this because it makes economic sense. So striving for leadership in the global clean energy transition is one of the smartest ways for Canada to play to its strength and deliver both economic sovereignty and a safer, more resilient, and competitive Canada. Thank you.
Bonjour, Kinoué. Bonjour, Kinoué Maganado. Jesse McCormick, Indigenous. My name is Jesse McCormick. I'm a proud citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation, the United Nation in Canada. I'm a lawyer working in the space where the future of Canada is being built, in the conversations between First Nations, governments, and proponents. This talk is about the confidence we need to have in each other to safeguard our economy and to secure Canada's independence in a tumultuous world. It's about Indigenous empowerment and the acceleration of economic growth. But most importantly, It is about trust. But first, a story about a bridge that took a long time to cross. I used to have a client in Manitoba, and for years they wrestled with Manitoba and Manitoba Hydro. Until one day when the hydro trucks came, the community members stopped them. And the driver asked, well, which way do I go? They told him, take the bridge. And he said, well, where's the bridge? They said, you haven't built it yet. The bridge was part of the Northern Flood Agreement signed in 1977. It was meant to provide a permanent all-weather road link to the provincial highway network. If Manitoba Hydro was going to flood First Nation lands and disrupt the ecosystems that they relied upon for millennia, they wanted to be able to drive in and out of their community in the summer, winter, spring, and fall. But the Kitchissippi Bridge wasn't constructed until 2002, almost 25 years later. First Nations across Canada have similar stories, and for many, their bridges have not yet been built. We can build major projects in Canada, but first we have to build trust. We have to create a context within which people will be confident in the projects being proposed and in the measures meant to protect their rights and interests. First Nations have to know that those promises will be fulfilled. And it's much more than simply creating economic opportunities. Equity option purchase agreements are not enough. The projects themselves need to be deserving of First Nation support so that leaders can secure the mandates they need so that they can stand shoulder to shoulder to shoulder with governments and proponents to build the infrastructure and major projects that uphold Canadian sovereignty. So if economic opportunity isn't enough, how do we get to yes in a way that is durable and can be celebrated? There are two answers. The first is free, prior, and informed consent, embracing wholeheartedly that scary idea that First Nations might say no, so that we can get to a real yes. The second answer is robust regulatory systems that put First Nations behind the wheel. So for First Nations, a regulatory system is both a safeguard and a point of entry. And I've seen how those processes can shape First Nations perceptions. Days upon days of cross-examination in the Northern Gateway hearings, sitting beside First Nations leaders defending Treaty 8 in the development of Site C. When the Harper government sought to cut back on environmental protections with Bills C-45 and C-38, I joined the Idle No More protests and pushed for political change. When there was a change in government, I had the privilege of advising the Minister of Environment and Climate Change on the development of the Impact Assessment Act, and later defended it before the Supreme Court of Canada as legal counsel to the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. Regulatory processes can be hard. They can reveal conflicts. They can slow things down. But they are part of our comparative advantage. They are the tools we use to ensure that what we build meets the needs of Canadians and protects what matters most. We can't build Canada strong unless we build in a way that deserves the confidence of Canadians. But right now, governments across this country are using the pressure of the moment to open doors to regulatory shortcuts. They're creating pathways around existing requirements to speed things up, while promising to uphold environmental protection and consultation obligations. That is a dangerous game, because it shifts the foundation of confidence from the regulatory system to political promises. And if those promises aren't kept, then the regulatory backbone that keeps our projects credible won't be there to save us. The projects themselves will become the politics, and the momentum will be lost. So if we want to build a more robust, independent Canadian economy, we need to put the confidence of Canadians first and put faith in the systems that First Nations can trust. We talk about partnerships, but is it really a partnership if you can't say no? A yes only means something if it is granted freely. For me, the best tool in our toolbox is First Nation-led impact assessments based on First Nations values. They're already happening across the country. Projects are getting built. First Nations are stepping up, evaluating projects on their own terms and deciding for themselves. In some cases, First Nations will say yes. And in some cases, First Nations will say no. But if we truly want to move faster, we should focus all of our energy on the projects that have earned that yes. If sovereignty and resilience are our goals, and we want to streamline approvals to get projects built faster, then it's time to reframe how we see First Nations participation. Not around the duty to consult and accommodate, but around the idea of consent. Because consultation won't get us where we need to go. When I think about that First Nation in Manitoba and the Kitchissippi Bridge that took so long to build, I think about how important it is for us to work together. It will take much more than concrete and steel to close the gap. Our bridges will be built from trust, consent, and confidence. If we build those first, the rest will stand. If we want to move fast, let's move fast together. Miigwech.
Well, good evening. My name is Richard Stursberg. I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to talk about a slightly more gloomy subject. I'm going to talk about cultural sovereignty. So what is cultural sovereignty? Cultural sovereignty is the ability to ensure that a country's media are capable of reflecting the country to itself. A country's books, TV, film, newspapers, and social media are the key instruments for exploring and understanding its history, values, sense of humor, dreams, mistakes, and moments of greatness. They are the foundations of national identity. In many ways, cultural sovereignty is the most important of all the sovereignties. When it's weakened or swamped by the media of others, a country's ability to know itself erodes, and its determination to preserve its independence. This is the situation English Canada finds itself in today. Our media is the weakest it has ever been. Historically, Canadian governments treated cultural sovereignty as a key element of the public agenda. The government of Pierre Trudeau ensured that the broadcasting system, radio, TV, and cable was owned and controlled by Canadians. It created tax arrangements that ensured Canadian advertising revenues would stay in Canada and finance Canadian media, including newspapers, magazines, and television. The Mulroney government strengthened Canadian ownership of book publishing, attempted to do so for film, and famously exempted the media from the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. The result of those policies were thriving newspaper, magazine, television, and radio businesses. We can all remember when newspapers were the thickness of a salami. The television news was an important part of everyone's day. Magazines like Maclean's and Chatelaine were central to the public conversation, and everyone read Margaret Atwood and Mordecai Richler's new books. Now, that is largely gone. For the last 20 years, through the mandates of Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, the Canadian government has reneged on its obligation to protect and strengthen our cultural sovereignty, and with it, our national identity. When Google and Netflix started selling ads in Canada, the governments allowed the tax advantages that had previously applied only to Canadian firms to apply to them. The money that had previously gone to support Canadian news, drama, comedies, and kids' shows poured into the coffers of Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and the other elf lords of Silicon Valley. Current estimates indicate that almost 2/3 of all Canadian advertising revenue now goes south. Later, when Netflix started broadcasting in Canada, the Harper and Trudeau governments allowed it to do so, despite the law explicitly requiring broadcasters to be Canadian-owned. They permitted all the streamers, Disney, Apple, Amazon, to operate here, contributing nothing to Canada. The Harper government campaigned against the Netflix tax, while the Canadian broadcasters not only had to pay tax, but also had to spend 50% of their gross revenues on Canadian content. The result is the wasteland we see today. The newspapers that survive, and scores have gone under, are shriveled fragments of their former selves, as are the magazines. The big private broadcast groups are in significant financial difficulty and have been losing money for 15 years. The Canadian publishers now take less than 5% of the domestic market. Viewing of Canadian shows has collapsed. The local and national news have lost about 40% of their viewers. Most young Canadians have disconnected from Canadian TV altogether, relying exclusively on the foreign streamers for their entertainment. Nor do they read Canadian newspapers or magazines, subscribing instead to TikTok, X, YouTube, and Facebook, all of which are stewards of misinformation. As Canada loses its ability to see itself and hear its own voice, it is perhaps not surprising that pride in the country has withered. 30 years ago, 80% of Canadians said that they were very proud to be Canadian. Now it's down to about 35%, with younger Canadians even less enthusiastic. Prime Minister Carney claims he wants to reverse these trends. He recognizes that Canada needs to reassert its own identity. Canadians agree. Whether in English Canada or French Canada, they have recoiled in dismay at Trump's bullying and attacks. There may never be a better time to recover our cultural sovereignty. But it will be hard. The rot is far gone. The Harper and Trudeau government's failures to defend Canadian cultural sovereignty makes it harder. Sovereignty not exercised grows weaker. There are two great initiatives before us that will determine, at least in part, whether we can rebuild our media. The CRTC has ruled that the streamers must spend 5% of their gross revenues on Canadian shows, not the 50% required of the major broadcast groups. The streamers have appealed the decision and asked the courts to strike it down. If they lose, they will ask Trump to intervene. The government has also indicated that it will reintroduce the Online Harms Act. The big social media companies will object. They have already torn down the limited arrangement that they had in place to monitor hate speech and disinformation. If the government acts to limit what can be carried on their platforms, they too will ask Trump to intervene. It's hard to see the government having the backbone to take on the Americans. It has already caved to Trump's pressure on the digital services tax. He will surely insist that Canada keep its hands off the big American streamers and social media companies. It's happened before. When the first Canadian-U.S. trade agreement was signed, Ronald Reagan told Mulroney that he could have a free trade deal or a film bill to strengthen the Canadian cinema industry. He really had no choice. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Deanna Horton. I'm going to be talking about Canada and three oceans sovereignty. Canada needs to redefine itself as a three oceans nation and devote resources to enhancing sovereignty in this space. As a former foreign policy practitioner, and as someone who's spent a good deal of time living in Asia and focusing on Asia, I have often bemoaned the fact that Canada seems intent on focusing on its Atlantic relationships. Our points of reference are NATO-driven. A couple of personal examples. When I was serving in the deputy's office in what was then the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, now Global Affairs Canada, there were many internecine squabbles about resources. It seemed to me that the legacy missions in Europe held greater sway than the posts in Asia, further away, both in distance and imagination. When I was doing G7 work in Japan, I was on occasion asked to represent the relevant department at meetings, too far to travel for Ottawa bureaucrats. I bet that would not have been the case if I had been in Paris or Rome. Getting over our reflex Atlanticism is still a challenge, in spite of the fact that our population is coming from another direction. The majority of recent immigrants originating in Asia. Canada now has an Indo-Pacific strategy, certainly a step in the right direction. But Canadian sovereignty has been shaped by our US-dependent and Atlanticist predilections. This was one of the topics in a book chapter I co-wrote in 2022, where we concluded that Canada remains unequipped to discharge any significant geostrategic role in Asia. I'm affiliated with the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, which does its valiant best to improve Asia competence in Canada. I have often been asked to speak to the Asian Institute students at the Munk School. I usually start with a graphic by the visual capitalist of the world economy. I like it because it's color-coded. All you have to do is see Asia at the top, dominating the regions. Asia is the key to Canada's economic prosperity, now and in the future. Yet we do not see Canadian students going to study in Asia as much as they go to study in USA or Europe. The Business Council of Canada has opened up an office in Asia for the first time. That's good news. Hopefully that will encourage more Canadian companies to do the same. But the interesting thing for me, when I was working on a research project at Munk, was that the Canadian tech companies that we had mapped in Asia had often gone to Asia first. This seemed counterintuitive. Why go all the way across the Pacific when you can do business in the USA? Well, this was a pattern that developed because of the strong thirst for innovation in Asia and because of the fact that it was often easier and cheaper to get things done, like have a prototype made, in places like Shenzhen in China. So for some at least, the myth that it is too difficult to enter these markets is just that, a myth. While I hope that our latest attempt at trade diversification will take advantage of Asian opportunities, thinking about Asia is still not Canada's reflex. When we talk about like-minded countries, we invariably think, at least in the first instance, about Europe. In November 2022, Global Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly spoke at the Munk School, stating, "For a long time, we saw Canada as a very important transatlantic partner, but we need to assert ourselves more as a Pacific nation." Japan initiated the Indo-Pacific concept when the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe talked of a free and open Indo-Pacific in 2016. Japan has stepped up, taking a leadership position when the United States walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. I contend that Canada should be thinking of itself as a North Pacific nation, and we should be defining our sovereignty in that context. Japan and South Korea are our staunch allies, but we don't appreciate them this way, or certainly not as much as we should. They are business partners. We three share a common security dependence on the USA, and we are worried about US commitment to allies. And we also have much in common with our Commonwealth buddies in the southernmost Pacific, Australia and New Zealand. And I believe they should have much to share with us on how to deal with the other economic superpower, China. Our sovereignty as a Pacific nation also underscores the need for us to exercise our sovereignty in the Arctic. 2 years ago, I was a research advisor to a very talented Munk student named Nicolas Bouchard, and we ended up writing a piece together on the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic, where we underlined the importance of Canada to leverage its limited impact by maximizing complementarity with its partners. The Arctic is growing even more important for Canada, given its strategic location between world powers and the increased access to natural resources and ship transportation routes due to climate change. And there is also growing interest from non-Arctic states in the Arctic, such as Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, and China has proclaimed itself a near-Arctic state. However, despite the significance of the Arctic for Canada, its governance and protection have not been viewed as a priority by many Canadians, or governments for that matter. The government has recently announced, finally, spending increases to bolster our Arctic defense sovereignty, but we will continue to need investments in Arctic-capable systems and technologies. Combining forces with NATO and Pacific partners in the Arctic would help share the burden, a burden which Canada has yet to fully embrace. Similarly, promoting investment from like-minded partners in much-needed infrastructure investment in the Arctic would help build resilience in these still fragile northern economies. Equally important, as three oceans nation, it is not enough to protect our sovereign spaces. The oceans are a shared resource. We should do all that we can to ensure the sustainability of these marine environments and further relations with Indigenous peoples in the Arctic and the Pacific. In conclusion, we now live in an unpredictable world. I don't think we are going back to status quo ante, the way things were before. By defining ourselves as a three oceans nation, Canada is not only better positioned to protect our sovereignty, but also to build partnerships in Asia and the Arctic with our friends in the Pacific. Prime Minister Carney is in Asia right now. People are paying attention. Let's hope that they continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is James Moore. Thank you to the Walrus for hosting this event. Thank you to Rogers for your investment in platforms such as this, and thank each of you in the audience for the privilege of your attention for a couple of minutes. It's true to say that the presidency of Donald Trump has been an enormous test and a stress test on institutions, politics, culture, the economy, and our patience, and much more. He announced his presidential candidate more than 10 years ago. He came down that golden escalator in the late spring of 2015, and the world has been captured by his presence ever since. It is possible that Prime Minister Carney and President Trump, perhaps with President Sheinbaum, could come to an agreement that would reaffirm the tripartite success of the North American trading platform and secure it for another generation. It's possible that that may happen. But because in spite of all the American political noise and the Canadian business panic, the reality is that the Canada-US trading relationship is profoundly successful. It is incredibly popular. It is stabilizing for security and is desired by both Americans and Canadians alike by overwhelming majorities of popular opinion in both countries. However, the fact of Trumpism, broadly defined as American antagonism toward the world and the hostility towards liberalized tariff-free trade, is not likely to go away anytime soon. The Trump effect is here for a long time. Donald Trump believes in tariffs, and his view is sacrosanct to everything that he believes in economically. In spite of any evidence or argument to the facts of the economic downside of his policy, he is locked into his view. And the Republican Party has entirely collapsed from the Ronald Reagan era through until today into a cult behind President Trump and his worldview. So it is what it is. The tariff policy shift is also, by the way, based on top of falsehoods. It's also based on some realities. And there are two. There's a fiscal reality and there's a political reality that come along with the Trump tariffs. The fiscal side of the reality of the Trump tariffs is that the tariffs that Donald Trump has so far brought in, perhaps likely to be escalated up over time, bring in about $30 billion of tax revenue every month into the US Treasury. The United States is desperate for tax revenue. They have put in place tax cuts that are utterly unaffordable, economically inconsistent, and their fiscal framework is blowing apart at the seams. The tax revenue that's coming in from these tariffs has been blessed not just by Democrats, by the way, but also by the Republican Party. The traditional party that is supposed to be against tax increases, against tax hikes, they have now blessed tariffs, which are the biggest tax hike that the United States has seen since 1993. So the traditional tax-cutting party is now the biggest tax-increasing party in the United States, blessed by their leader, and the party is not likely to turn back on that policy anytime soon. The U.S. tariffs that have been brought in by President Trump amount to a $2,000 per household tax for every American family in the United States. And it's being blessed, and over 40% of Americans believe that they're not paying it, that foreigners are paying it. We are living in a world that is beyond understanding and not based in any kind of reality. But again, it is what it is, and you have to accept reality on reality's terms. So the tax is not only needed on the tariff side because of the revenue that it brings in, but it's also needed on the political side. In the last 12 presidential elections in the United States, the candidate who won both the states of Michigan and Pennsylvania won 10 out of the 12 last presidential election campaigns. So why does that matter to tariffs? Because when you hear steel and aluminum tariffs, hear the word Pennsylvania. When you hear the word auto tariffs, hear the state Michigan. You cannot win the presidency of the United States without winning Michigan and Pennsylvania combined. 10 of the last 12 presidential campaigns were won by candidates who won both of those states. So they need the money, and the candidates need the Electoral College. So when 2028 comes around, and Steve Bannon says that President Trump is going to offer himself as the Republican candidate for the 4th time, he may or may not be on the ballot, we'll see. But whether it's Trump, or it's Vance, or it's Newsom, or it's Hawley, or whoever it may be, the Electoral College math is still the same. The revenue needs are still the same. We can get angry at Donald Trump, and we can decry the reality of his tariff policies and what it's doing to Canada and what it's doing to the Canada-U.S. relationship in terms of trade. But the fact of the revenue, the necessity of the revenue, the fact of the politics will not change when the orange man is gone. So what does this mean for Canada in terms of what we should do going forward? And I think this is clearly a moment for a call to action. And I'm here to talk about the economic sovereignty of Canada. And Canada is a brilliant country. We are capable of remarkable things. We're a country that has overcome enormous traumas and challenges throughout the sweep of our history in this country. From the Quiet Revolution to the October Crisis, to the Meech in Charlottetown, to referenda on destroying this country, to quiet revolutions, to all kinds of crises that we've had in our country. We've overcome divisions in this country that would absolutely destroy most countries in this world. From French and English, Protestant and Catholic in the early days, North and South, East and West, we have overcome enormous challenges that are still there, and they still need to be triaged and supported and managed through the fullness of time. But we are a country that can survive and will survive, and we need to move forward. Everybody talks about the virtues of the economic partnership within Canada, and it's there, but it is not yet fully fulfilled. Prime Minister Carney talks about elbows up and the need to break down internal barriers to trade, but he stops short of actually getting the ball across the goal line. He talked in the election campaign about the virtues of East-West internal trade and breaking down barriers. And by the way, so did Pierre Trudeau, and so did Bob Stanfield, and so did Brian Mulroney, and so did Stephen Harper, and so did Justin Trudeau, and so did Jean Chrétien, and so did Paul Martin, and so did Pierre Poilievre. Everybody talks a good game. Everybody talks a good game. And when I was Minister of Industry, I took a big run at trying to solve this riddle, and I learned a lot in the process. And the fact that American tariff necessity on the political side and the economic side is not going to go anytime soon, it means that this is a call to action. And I think Canadians are prepared to see real leaders take real action in order to get internal barriers to trade beaten down so that Canadians could do more business with each other than we do with the United States. Let's fortify the Canadian Economic Union and the Canadian family and do more business with each other than we have in the past than ever before. And there are 4 things that we can do to show real leadership to get this thing done. Prime Minister Carney talked a good game in the election campaign, and I'm glad that he talked a good game because at least he's emotionally and politically committed to it. But getting the job done means going much further than what he's done so far. He has said that he will break down the federal government's barriers to internal trade. Well, that's good, but that constitutes about 5% of the problem. The other 95% of the problem means getting the provinces on side to show leadership and to push in the right direction. It's one thing for Premier Ford to pull out a bottle of Crown Royal and look like a tough guy. It's another thing to replace that bottle of Crown Royal with some British Columbia wine so we can have East-West trade within the country. So what can we do? Here's what I propose. There are 4 things that we can do to actually get the ball moving in a meaningful way to break down internal barriers to trade. First, demand direct engagement of Canada's premiers. When I was minister and we tried to break down internal barriers to trade, there were some really thoughtful men and women, colleagues of mine who were my counterparts on the provincial side. They all talked a good game and they were earnest and sincere and they came to the table and they really wanted to get it done. But the reality is that the premiers really run the show in the provinces. If Prime Minister Carney wants to get this done and really wants to get the ball across the goal line, have a First Ministers' Conference specifically on internal barriers to trade and insist that the premiers themselves show up. Put down the pouring out of the bottle of the Crown Royal, stop the posturing, stop the nonsense, stop the Daniel Smith and saying we're going to build a pipeline, show up to a meeting and be committed to making sure we have internal barriers to trade that are reciprocal and across this country. First thing, make the premiers own it and make them show up and do it personally. Second, start fresh. Canada is one of the most free trading countries in the world. We're the only country in the world with tariff-free binding, non-tariff access to more than 52% of the global economy. We're a true trading country, free trading country. From the Hudson Bay Company through FTA, NAFTA, CPTPP, Canada-Europe free trade, all of it. We have more binding free trade access to any other country in the world. And when we start our free trade negotiations, we always start from an assumption that there will be open free trade, and then you can pile on exemptions that others have talked about having some kind of barriers to trade that are important for domestic reasons. But you start with an assumption of equal trade and equal access across the country that Canadians think should be the default anyway. So make sure the premiers show up, make sure they commit from a default position to having no internal barriers to trade. And then if they want to stack on barriers to trade for government procurement or for culture or for language, then make the argument and do so publicly and clearly and transparency, but put your name on it and own it as a premier and make sure you make your argument, and let's do it so we can understand each other better as Canadians and have the dialogue. Third thing we should do is that any final agreement on internal barriers to trade, premiers have to surrender some of their provincial sovereignty. You have to commit to a binding mechanism for dispute settlements that has teeth and is quick and is efficient, so that you can say that it may not serve my local economic interest, but it serves the Canadian interest, and you have to be prepared to have a vehicle that will adjudicate disputes about internal free trade and surrender some of that sovereignty for the betterment of this country. It's been noted that the great Peter Lougheed is routinely mentioned as one of the greatest premiers of this country. And unlike some premiers of the province of Alberta, Peter Lougheed said very famously, "I am an Albertan and I am a proud Albertan, but I'm a Canadian first." We need more premiers in this country who talk their talk, but walk their talk, show up in person, are prepared to surrender to some dispute settlement mechanisms and put the country first. And the fourth thing that we need to do in order to get this thing done is we need to broadcast the whole thing live so Canadians can see it. We have had, look, we're used to this now. We see politics all the time. Barriers have been broken down. We see stuff on our phones. We know politics from 8 inches from our face in 4K resolution, and we can see sincerity. As the kids say it, real recognizes real. And we know politicians when they're full of it, and we know politicians when they are sincere. Let's get them all in a room. Let's make sure they own it. Let's make sure they walk their talk. Be committed to openness as a starting point. Educate us on why you think there should be barriers, and let's learn a little bit of something about our country. And let's air it and broadcast it so Canadians can hold everybody accountable and be honest and sincere about whether or not you put your politics first or do you put your country first. Do you put trade first or do you put your re-election first? And let's make sure that Canadians can see the dialogue, learn from each other, build a better country, and break down those internal barriers to trade. Have the premiers own it. Start from an assumption of openness, make sure that we have dispute settlement that works, and broadcast it so Canadians can see. And then we will really be elbows up. Then we'll be trading as much with Canadians as we do with Americans. And then we can stop the talk and really move forward to a more sovereign economic Canada. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Sean Speer, and I belong to a binational household. My oldest was born in the Ottawa area. My youngest is an American citizen, and so as you can imagine, things got a bit intense during the Four Nations Cup earlier this year. I'm going to talk tonight about 2 recent historical anniversaries in order to engage with tonight's question of sovereignty and my own topic of economic nationalism. The first, 50 years ago, late last month, is the failure of an effort to create an automaker in the province of New Brunswick. Some people here might remember the Bricklin. The Bricklin was, well, the Bricklin didn't ultimately, it failed. It was a catastrophic effort between the government of the Hatfield today and an eccentric, idiosyncratic American millionaire to establish a auto company in the province of New Brunswick. The Bricklin, of course, had sleek gull-wing doors. It looked a lot like the DeLorean, for those who don't remember it. It lasted for about 12 months. There were roughly 3,000 cars that came off the production line, and today are an interest of collector curiosity, but not a durable, sustainable part of the New Brunswick economy. And I think we need to understand the Bricklin in a way as a metaphor for this broader conversation that we're having today about economic nationalism. It's important to note that the Bricklin comes from a particular moment in our history that has a lot of similarities to the one we're facing. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, we were marked by a wave of Canadian economic nationalism. The centennial, of course, had sparked a new pride and a lot of patriotism in the country. The Vietnam War and the Nixon administration's protectionism created distance from the United States. Many were worried that American business and culture were swallowing us whole. So Ottawa and the provinces decided that sovereignty required economic independence, and the government would do what was necessary in order to create and protect Canadian industry and technologies. We subsidized domestic industry. We tried to insulate ourselves from global markets. People would be familiar with things like Petro-Canada, the Foreign Investment Review Act, the expansion of the CanCon regulations, so on and so forth. We were in an era of economic nationalism. I think it's fair to say, in hindsight, it was a mostly unsuccessful project. It contributed to the stagflation of the 1970s. It was inefficient and distortionary. One of my favorite quotes of the era is from the late great economist Harry Johnson, who spent about as much time drinking as he did writing. And so he may have been experimenting with something new at the time, but he wrote, quote, "Economic nationalism is diverting Canada into a narrow and garbage-cluttered cul-de-sac," unquote. Now, even if one thinks that that may have been alcohol-induced, it's fair to say by the early 1980s, there was a growing recognition, even on the part of Pierre Trudeau's government, that something had to change, that these efforts to effectively engineer and protect different parts of Canada's economy represented a downward pressure on investment and employment and so on. And people may remember, which brings me to my second anniversary, the Prime Minister of the day appointed Donald MacDonald, a former cabinet minister, to chair a Royal Commission on the Economic Union and Development Prospects of Canada. His report came out 40 years ago last month. And people, of course, are familiar with the recommendation that Canada pursue free trade with the United States, which, of course, the Mulroney government ultimately did. But it was more fundamental than that. The MacDonald Commission reflected a kind of ethos about the role of markets and the role of government, and the need for Canadians not to feel insecure, but to feel bold and ambitious about our capacity to compete in global markets. There's a famous line in the MacDonald report where he says there are fewer places to hide, and that's okay, because Canada can compete if we open ourselves up to competition within our economy and competition globally. That economic openness, in other words, wasn't a surrender. It was an expression of confidence. And so we saw, I think it's fair to say, one way to understand the past 40 years or so of Canadian political economy is that we have taken steps to rid ourselves of a lot of the vestiges of that last episode of economic nationalism, liberalizing parts of our economy, trying to create fair and open forms of competition, encouraging foreign direct investment from different parts of the world. And yet, in the face of Trump's threat, we seem to be going through an episode of deja vu. Half a century later, a lot of those new ideas are finding salience. The language has changed a bit, but the underlying impulses are the same. We talk about resilience and security and sovereignty. And what's interesting is that while economic nationalism in the 1960s and 70s were principally a progressive political project, they're increasingly conservative ones today, inspired in part by the economic policy program of the Trump administration and center-right governments elsewhere in the Anglo-American world. So it's notable, for instance, that we've seen the Poilievre-led conservatives calling for protection of different parts of Canada's economy, calling on the government to block foreign investments and so on. And I think this is a mistake. I think we have to keep in mind that sovereignty isn't isolation. It's the freedom to choose in a world that's interdependent. And it seems to me the great success, that what we learned through that experience from the Bricklin to the McDonald Commission report, is that when we open ourselves up to competition, when we reach out into the world, Canadian companies, Canadian industries, Canadian technologies can be successful, that we can compete and win. And so as we face the current threat of the Trump administration, this instinct to turn inward, I think is precisely the wrong reaction. We can't out-Trump Trump. The best we can do is to have the kind of ambition and boldness and self-confidence that marked the 1985 Royal Commission and the decades of policy that ensued thereafter. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to our talkers, Stephen Maher, Marisa Beck, Jesse McCormick, Richard Stursberg, Deanna Horton, the Honorable James Moore, and Sean Speer. I have a couple notes. James, I think we need to plan the Walrus Talks premieres. Sounds like that would go over well with this group. And let's move from talking a good game to playing a good game. We can compete and win. A round of applause for our speakers this evening. Now, I'm going to invite our front row of talkers to get up and head to the reception so they have an opportunity to grab a drink first. So if you want to stand up and do so. And while you do that, I'm going to tell the rest of the room a little bit more about what we have coming up. If you enjoyed tonight's event, join us online on Tuesday, November 4th, for the Walrus Talks at Home, Place and Belonging. 4 expert speakers will share their perspectives on how the spaces we design and invest in can strengthen our social fabric. And then on Wednesday, November 12th, join us in Vancouver or by live stream for the Walrus Talks Philanthropy in a Changing Canada. 7 speakers will discuss how philanthropy and charities are evolving to meet the needs of the communities they serve. The best way to stay in touch with the Walrus is to sign up for our newsletter. You can do that if you're here in the room. Outside, we have a table set up, or you can opt into our newsletters in the follow-up email, which will land in your inbox tomorrow. We encourage you to subscribe to the Walrus. We have a special offer for those of you in Toronto, a full year subscription to the Walrus. That's 8 issues delivered right to your door for $25. It's a great deal. Visit the Walrus table and our team will set you up. The Walrus is a unique beast in the Canadian media landscape. We're a registered charity, which means we are powered by people like you. With your support, we can ensure that everyone has access to responsible, fact-based coverage on the very issues that shape Canada's future. We explored a few of them this evening. You can donate to the Walrus at thewalrus.ca/support or come by the table in the lobby. All donations $20 or more are eligible for a tax receipt. Thanks again to the team at Rogers for making tonight's talks possible. Thank you to our national sponsors, Air Canada, Bullfrog Power, Inspire, RBC, and Rogers. And thank you all for attending and being a part of the talks. Have a great evening.